Hello, and welcome to a presentation on adaptation and variation. Over the next wee while, we'll be discussing then a bit about how variation takes place, what is variation, also a bit about natural selection, and also about artificial selection. So stick with us and we'll hear it all. The first thing is to think about what variation actually is. If we look at a typical class, you'll find then that everybody looks a bit different. Some people are bigger, some people are smaller, some people have red hair, some people have black hair, some people have blonde hair. Everyone's different. And that's called variation. Now, variation has different kinds. There is a kind then called continuous variation and a kind called discontinuous variation. And we're going to be learning about these two kinds of variation over the next few slides. Now, if we think about continuous variation, first of all, a good example of continuous variation is height. Now, we know, of course, that you can't be very tall or very small and nothing in between. There's a continuous spectrum going from people who are very small, then a bit small, then medium height, then tall, and then very tall. So there's a continuous spectrum, and therefore there's not distinct groups. So this is called continuous variation. Now, if you're plotting a graph of continuous variation, what you do is you plot a histogram. Now this is histogram here. If you look here, we have this kind of pattern, but also what we have is we've got no gaps in between the bars. Now that then is called then a histogram. That's different from a bar chart, but this is a histogram. But that's continuous variation and how we should plot continuous variation. Now, another example of continuous variation then is also then we have is our weight. Now, weight again, then you're not always very heavy or very light. You're always somewhere in between then. So again, what we can do is we can plot that on a graph. Now here we have, in fact, then we've got birth weight of babies, an old term ounces. And we've got then the number of babies with those weights. Now again, you can see then it is a histogram being plotted. Again, no spaces between the bars. Now, if we compare that then with the other kind of a variation, that kind then is discontinuous variation. Now, this is where you do have distinct groups. You either can do it or you can't do it. So, for example, a good example of this then would be then whether or not you can roll your tongue. Now, I can't roll my tongue, but most of you, I'm sure, can in fact roll your tongue. It doesn't matter how silly I look trying to do it, I just can't do it. Now, just a wee picture of somebody who can roll their tongue, I can't do that. A lot of you, I'm sure, can do that then. Now, again, if we think about a graph of tongue rolling, then what happens in fact then is you either can or you can't. So the graph looks a bit like this. We now then have two distinct groups. You can either roll your tongue or you can't roll your tongue. And therefore we plot then a bar chart. Okay, you can see then we have got a big space between the bars here then. Now, another example of discontinuous variation is in terms then of blood groups. Now, again, if you know what blood type you are, there's different kinds of blood types. There is blood group A, blood group B, blood group AB, and blood group O. But again, you have then 4 distinct groups. There are other factors too, like rhesus positive and rhesus negative, but let's keep it simple with the first 4 blood groups. So again, what we have is you're either type O, which I am, type A, type B, or type AB. Again, this is discontinuous variation, and therefore you put spaces between the bars. So it's a bar graph or a bar chart. Now, if we think then about some things which cause variation. Now, we've got then genetic reasons, and we also then have environmental reasons. If we concentrate first of all on the genetic. Now, one of the reasons why we have variation and genetic variation is because of mutations. Now, a mutation is a change in the structure of DNA or even the number of chromosomes. For example, we know that Down syndrome is caused by having an extra chromosome. In fact, an extra chromosome 21. And that is mutation, and that is an example of genetic variation. Other examples include cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, and a few other ones which are caused by problems with the genes and with the DNA. Now then also we have environmental variation. Now if we think about environmental variation, now this could be as simple as possibly a person who lives in a poor country, and maybe both of their parents happen to be quite tall, but because they don't get enough food, then their body doesn't grow as well as it should, and therefore they are small, and that would be an example of environmental variation. Another example might be if you plant crops in a field, and some years then maybe it isn't as sunny, or maybe there isn't enough nutrients in the soil, the plants will not grow as well. So again, that's another example then of environmental variation. There are even plants which will produce pink flowers in acidic soil and white flowers in alkaline soil. So obviously that's an example, a good example of environmental variation. Now, because everything is different, it means then that things can become adapted to the environment, which leads us on then to the next little unit then. Now what I have here is I have a picture here of a polar bear. And polar bears are adapted, they're specialized then for living at the North Pole then. If we look at this polar bear here, you'll find then that a few things which makes them adapted. One is they've got these big, large, furry feet, so as they don't sink into the snow, and they can walk across the top of the snow. We know, of course, as well that they have this white fur, and this is so as they can sneak up on their prey. If they're trying to hunt, for example, a seal, they'll try and hide at the edge of the ice, wait for the seal to appear, and then jump into the water to try and catch the seal then. So these are just some adaptations of a polar bear. And most things are adapted to their environment. Because all organisms are different, the ones which are better adapted are the ones which will survive and then will pass their genes, which have caused the advantage, on to the next generation. Which brings us nicely on to the topic then of natural selection. Now, natural selection has been summed up in survival of the fittest. And again, there is a good reason why that's the case. Let's think about then what happens during natural selection. Now, the first person who had the idea of natural selection was a man called Charles Darwin, who lived now about 200 years ago. And he was a very famous scientist, and he decided that he wanted to travel around the world and explore the world. And he was friendly, in fact, then with some people who were part of the king's entourage, and he decided that he would travel around the world with them. He went on a trip then, on a ship then, which was called then the HMS Beagle. Here's Charles Darwin here, and here then is his ship, the HMS Beagle. Now he went all around the world on this ship, collecting different specimens from lots of different areas. I'm sure it was a great journey. I'd love to have gone myself. But he went around in the world, and what he did then was he collected different samples. Now, one of the places that he went to, in fact, then was a place called the Galapagos Islands. You can see it down here in the map, just off the coast of South America. And some of his best research came from his time which he spent on this island. Now, this island is famous for a few things. One is famous for is giant turtles. My mother-in-law has been there and has showed me the pictures of the turtles. But also it's famous then because of the work which he did then. Now, one of the things that he looked at, in fact, then was he looked at birds. He liked his birds, and what happened was he studied then some finches on the island. Now, this is a picture of a finch here. Now, he realized then that his idea was that maybe on these islands, and the islands are quite separate from each other, he realized then that possibly there was one finch, one kind of finch at the start. So let's assume here that this is the one. This is what the finch looked like at the start then. Now, he found in the different islands that he went to, some islands had lots of fruit, some islands had lots of nuts, some islands had lots of seeds. So different islands tended to have different food to eat. And he found, in fact, then that if an island, for example, then had lots of nuts, like hard nuts, like acorns, if they had lots of nuts then on the island, he found then that the birds on the island, the finches on the island, tend to have big, strong beaks. So you can see we have these big, strong beaks then. On a different island, he found that there was lots of seeds. There wasn't much vegetation, but there was lots of seeds in the island, and animals then which had long beaks and could kind of reach down and get to some of these seeds then and get in to find more of these seeds tend to survive better. So these are the ones which have then the big beaks. So he thought, well, maybe they all started off exactly the same, but over time on the different islands with the different food sources, they changed and they adapted. And this was his idea then of natural selection. Now, from this, lots of people have done different parts of research in natural selection. Now, one of the famous pieces of research then is involving then peppered moths. Now, what are pepper moths? So pepper moths look a bit like this, okay? These are the moths. We all have seen moths around the house at some stage in, but these are moths, and the moths come in different colors. You have some moths then which are white, and you have some moths which are peppered or kind of black then. Now, the kind of moth has changed over time. If we go back quite a long time to the Industrial Revolution, in this picture here, you'll find that all the soot from the factories and all the pollution, it ended up going on the trees. And here we have lots of trees in the cities then, which had lots of soot on them. Now, if you look at the moths, some of the moths then were black, and some of the moths then were white. Now, what happened then was any birds who were trying to eat the moths, they couldn't see then the black moths as easily. And therefore, what would happen is they'd eat the moths, which were easier to see, which of course then were the white moths. So where the white moths stood out then on the black trees, the white moths got eaten. So over time, the black moths were more common. However, then come along another 50 or 100 years, the factories, then there weren't as many factories putting a lot of pollution out, and therefore then the actual soot wasn't covering the trees anymore. So we had lots of soot in these trees. As the environment got a bit cleaner, and also in the countryside, what happens in fact is we have these trees here, which are not covered in soot and which are more kind of a greeny white color. Now in those areas and in that time, the birds then were trying to find moths to eat, and of course now then the actual black moths were at a disadvantage then. So this black moth here stood out. The actual birds could see it more easily, and therefore then the black moths were eaten then. So in these areas at this time, the white moths became more common than the black moths. So you can see the ones which were better adapted, they survived, and what happened was they survived and reproduced, and therefore then the next generation had more, in this case, more white moths, because they survived better then. Now, if we move on from there, Darwin had different conclusions then. Now, what he thought then was he had then these ideas here. He said then that in all populations, there were differences, okay? Now, if you remember, a word which we used was phenotypes. Phenotypes is what we can see, okay? So things like the color and the height and even the number of flowers produced were all examples of phenotypes. And he realized that there was lots of variation in different phenotypes. So some animals were stronger, some animals were weaker. There's lots of variation then. If there was competition for resources, there's a struggle for existence. Okay, and a good example of that then is maybe on the savannah, you've got lions, and the lions might be chasing gazelles. Now, lions aren't stupid. Lions will go for the easiest ones to catch. So the weaker gazelles are the ones who get eaten. The faster gazelles, the stronger gazelles, they will survive, they will reproduce, and that will pass on to the next generation then. Now, this is summed up in his last one then. The better adapted ones survive, reproduce, and pass on their genes to the next generation. So natural selection has been shown at lots of different times in lots of different areas. But you've heard of me waffling on about Charles Darwin. Let's hear from the man himself.
People thought all animals arrived here unrelated. The world began and then came man, all perfectly created. But then someone looked up a tree and said that monkey looks just like me. So it really was a mystery what I'd learned in natural history. So I joined HMS Beagle, watched the eagle and the seagull. We studied rocks and plants, flowers, trees and bees and ants. Slept on hammocks without pillows, eating rats and armadillos, till I realised on reflection it's natural selection. Natural selection means each animal evolved to blend with its surroundings. Changes were involved. So birds with different foods to seek seemed to have developed different beaks, and over time they'd modified, so just the fittest of them all survived. On the Isles of Galapagos, I noted that giant otters had interesting shells, and I rode on them as well. Iguanas land and swimming meant my new theory was winning. It all led in the direction of natural selection. My findings met with outrage from the Church of England and from me. The idea that we came from chimps questioned my own Christianity, but it was hard to disagree. Every species' new mutation had a perfect explanation. It seemed the world's inception must predate common perception, and in lack of adaptation is a fatal limitation. So each creature's imperfection over time gets a correction, meaning animal collections grow unique means of protection, and to fail nature's inspection means immediate rejection, which all leads to the detection of natural selection. Natural selection.
So, natural selection. So, anytime there is a fight for existence, the ones which are stronger will survive and reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation. So, over time, the stronger ones survive and the weaker ones will die out. Survival of the fittest. Now, let's think about then when else this is happening then. Now, we have then, in fact, a situation at the minute then where we have superbugs. I don't mean the COVID-19. I mean the ones that have been around and we've researched here for the last few years. Bugs such as MRSA and C. difficile are examples of superbugs. And these are bugs then which are causing problems. Here we have an example here of a headline which talks about then one of these superbugs then. So what do we mean by a superbug? Well, this is the bug then, could be bacteria, could be something else. A bug then which it's quite difficult to deal with. Okay, what has happened in fact then is maybe some of our best medicines, some of our best antibiotics no longer kill these bacteria, for example then. Now, you might have seen the adverts telling us not to use antibiotics all the time, not to go to the doctor all the time. And the reason for that, in fact, is because the more times the bacteria see a certain antibiotic, the more chance it has then of mutating and changing, and therefore the antibiotic will no longer kill it anymore. If we kind of show an example of what we mean here, now what we have is we've got here lots then of bacteria. Okay, these are all bacteria. Now, if you have a look closely, though, we've got some ones in here which then have become resistant. So they've mutated, a change has taken place in their DNA, and the mutation has caused them to become resistant then to the antibiotics. So here's one here, a small red one here, and a small red one here. Now, as long as we've got lots of normal ones and only a small amount then of the resistant ones, they all compete for food, they all compete for resources, and therefore the number of resistant ones are kept quite small. However, if you get sick, you go to the doctor, and if the doctor gives you antibiotics, what happens is antibiotics will kill off then the normal bacteria then which are not resistant then. So all these normal ones are all killed off. And what happens in fact then is you're left behind with a few normal ones, but you're also left behind with these two resistant ones. Now there's no longer lots of normal ones to compete with the resistant ones. And therefore what happens in fact, if you have a look here, over time we get more and more of the bugs which are now resistant to the antibiotics. So over time, this is an issue. Now, for years, the World Health Organization said that the biggest threat to human life was antibiotic resistance. Now, we know, of course, at the minute we're sitting in a situation with COVID-19. And again, it is an issue as well because we don't have a vaccine for it. And we don't at the minute have any medicine which is going to be killing it off then. So again, this is a similar situation then. But let's move on. So we've shown then that natural selection takes place. Okay, we could look at giraffes, we could look at lots of different things, which shows that natural selection takes place. Now, this then led to the idea of evolution. And Charles Darwin, of course, is famous for having the idea of natural selection and then leading on from there into evolution. Now, evolution is defined then as the change in species over time. Now, we're talking normally here about a long period of time. It could be, in this case, it could be thousands of years then. But evolution can be defined as a change in species over time. To kind of show you the famous picture for this, you'll see then we have the idea that we have some kind of common ancestor, which is here. And what has happened then is over time then we have changed and changed and changed and changed into then what we are now then. Now, a few misconceptions. George Darwin didn't say we came from monkeys. What he did say was he said then that humans, like ourselves, and monkeys both came from the same ancestors then. So this is the idea of evolution. Now again, there's lots of evidence which people would mention in terms of evolution. And one of the biggest sources of evidence comes from then fossils. I'm sure we've all seen fossils before at some stage. Now, fossils are found then when animals die. Maybe they die, and what happens in fact is they fall maybe into a river or into streams or somewhere else. And what happens in fact then is that we have a lot of sediment getting laid on top of them. Now, there's only certain situations where the animals will not be completely decomposed. So what happens is they will die somewhere, something will kind of cover the area, and over time, it could be thousands of years, the animals get compressed, and what happens is you're left behind simply with the bones, like you have in this situation here then. If we go back and we look to see what bones you find in which areas, then we can start to think, well, possibly then this animal was around first of all, and then maybe a bit later this animal was around, and this animal was around, and this animal was around. And again, this is evidence which has been put forward for evolution. For example, if you go to the Grand Canyon that I was at, in fact, last year, you can see then different layers of rock. And in different layers of rock, there's different fossils. And again, the ones then which are older rocks have more simple fossils, and the ones then which are more recent have more complicated fossils then. Again, this is evidence being put forward then for evolution. This is a famous example here, Archaeopteryx, and this is one then which kind of shows a kind of a link then between birds and reptiles then. So again, evolution has been suggested, and certainly fossils are one of the ideas being put forward for this then. Again, we've got lots of different fossils out there, lots of fossils all around the world, fossils for dinosaurs and for lizards and for lots of different things. Now, one of the ones, in fact, we have an extensive fossil record for is, in fact, then horses, okay? And again, what we can do is we can look to see how horses have changed over time. Now, at one stage, horses were much smaller over here, but as time has gone on, we find then that the horses are bigger and like they are than today then. So let's try and think then why this might be. Well, again, it's to do really with the environment. We said if the environment changes, then the horses will adapt to this then. If we look here, there's a bit in this chart here. This obviously is the time. So we've got time here. Now, if we look at how the habitat changes, well, thousands of years ago, the horses lived in areas where it was quite wet. Now, if it's quite wet, then we don't want to sink into the ground, and therefore the hoof size, okay, size of the feet then, hoof size is much larger back then. We don't want very heavy horses too, so therefore then size of the horses was quite small. And we're saying then that back then it was the ground was a lot wetter then. Now then if you go on further, and maybe more recently then you're going to find it's gone from these wet marshes down into these dry grasslands. So it's gone from wet marshes, which they might sink into, these dry grasslands. Therefore, they don't need to have big, large feet anymore. They tend to be, their hoofs tend to be slightly smaller then. Okay. Also, size-wise, again, then if we're taller, then we're quite often we're stronger. And also, if you're taller than these horses here, they can look around and then look out for predators. So again, there's advantages of being bigger as time has gone on then. So things change by natural selection, and evolution is a suggestion then that over a long, long period of time, that things have gone from one species then to another species. Now, if things do not adapt, then what happens is they might become endangered. Now out there, we've got lots of different animals which are now endangered. Famous example, of course, is in terms of bears, pandas, and obviously the World Wildlife Fund has the panda as its emblem because that is an animal which is in danger. But there's lots of animals which are in danger, and each year what happens, in fact, is that scientists around the world publish a list called the Endangered Species List, and every year we've got more and more animals going on that list. Then, big cats, for example, like our tigers. Or in parts of the world begin to be endangered then. But again, every year, animals you might never have heard of become extinct. Now, some famous examples of ones you know about which have become extinct, of course, we've got dinosaurs. Okay, dinosaurs. Now, some would argue then that some of our reptiles, like crocodiles and alligators, were around about the same time as the dinosaurs. But certainly, most of these dinosaurs, the famous T-Rex and what have you, they have, of course, become extinct then now then. There's none left. Extinction means that there's none left at all. Other examples we have as well, we've got a woolly mammoth, again, bit like a big elephant, okay, lived in areas where it was very cold. Of course, there's no more woolly mammoths about. And then another one, of course, is the dodo. The dodo, no one's really sure exactly what a dodo looks like. This is a drawing, of course, of someone's idea. I doubt he looked just like that then. But we've got dodos as well. Again, that they died out. Some have put forward an idea then that people discovered the dodos. Dodos had never encountered man before. The men brought with them dogs, just pets, and the dogs would chase and kill then these dodos. And the dodos then hadn't seen dogs before, didn't know to run away from the dogs, and therefore then they simply stood there and they were killed. Okay, so this idea of being dumb as a dodo is kind of where that comes from then. So these are animals which we know have become extinct then. Again, there could be different reasons why these animals become extinct. One of the more exotic ones then is by natural disasters. So, for example, we think then the dinosaurs might have been killed off then because of an asteroid strike. So maybe a meteor then might have hit the Earth. The meteor had produced a massive crater in the Earth, and what happens, in fact, is it threw a lot of dust into the air. Now, that dust then, there was so much dust, in fact, then, that it blocked out parts of the sun, and for maybe several years then, the Earth got very little sun. Now, we know, of course, if it doesn't get any sun, the plants cannot photosynthesize, the plants will die, and the things which need the most food, the biggest things, are the things which will die off first then. So dinosaurs, which obviously, a lot of them certainly were big, they then could not survive then in this climate then. So that might be one reason for an extinction. Other ones we have as well, Well, we have, of course, hunting. Now, this could be hunting by humans. In fact, it could also be hunting by other animals. Now, this is a picture here of a man who has shot this elephant. Seems very proud then of the fact that he shot this elephant then. Now, that, of course, is one reason why animals might become extinct then. Elephants, for example, now, elephants, of course, have these tusks. And what happens is that the people then who are hunting these elephants are hunting it for the tusks, for the ivory in the tusks. Now, people out there, of course, don't want that to happen. And therefore, one thing, in fact, which they might do is they might cut off these tusks. And therefore, the hunters will not kill the elephants. Other examples of this include then, we've got then, for example, in some parts of the world, we've got then tiger and tiger teeth, and ground up tiger teeth then is seen as a sign then of virility and making you more able to have kids would be another thing which happens. Another reason why animals are hunted then. Okay, so hunted by humans, hunted by other animals too. If you introduce an animal from one country into another country, and the other country has not seen it, the animals there don't know to hide from it, and therefore as well, there's a lot of damage done by animals as well. Now, another example is too, well, disease. Disease is a big killer here. Here we have a rabbit which has mixed mitosis, an awful disease in which the rabbits will get then. Again, it's a disease which came along here and wiped out large amounts of rabbits then. So again, that's another reason why extinction might take place then. However, the biggest loss of animals, the biggest reason for extinction of animals is because of humans, and not by hunting, but in fact then by destruction then of habitats. So where you've got countries around the world and you've got then forests and you have rainforests, for example, a lot of these areas are being chopped down, or even worse, being burnt down, so as people can use the land to grow their own crops, or possibly for roads, or to get wood for timber, for lots of different reasons. Animals, of course, need habitats. If we destroy the habitats, then you destroy the animals. So the biggest reason, in fact, then for loss of life on Earth is humans, and is because then of loss of habitat. Now, what then can we do? Well, we obviously want to try and slow down extinctions. Now, there's different ways in which, as an Earth, we can do this. So one of the ways then is by legislation. Now, legislation or rules laid down by the government. We'll talk about then how we can try and prevent then, for example, the sale of endangered animals. So, for example, then in China, certain things are caught then, and people around the world might want to buy these things, but they're not allowed to be shipped into the country. So legislation is one way in which we can try and prevent the hunting of endangered species and the sale of endangered species as well. And also we have as well, again, we've got international agreements. We've got then different times, and we've got then times when the governments meet and they agree things in it. And again, it's cross-border communication here. There's different examples here. There's the Kyoto Protocol, for example, in Japan would be an example of agreement then, which is to do then with reduction of pollution. But there's also agreements out there which is linked then with the endangered species market as well. And nature reserves. If we have places where the animals can survive and be safe, then they will reproduce. So nature reserves are another good example then of ways in which we can try then and increase the population of certain animals then. And also, of course, we can educate people. If people don't know then that, for example, throwing plastic bags out and getting into the rivers and getting into the streams and getting into the oceans, if they don't know this, then they'll keep on doing it. Like, for example, we've got then animals that there we mentioned earlier on. We mentioned turtles. Turtles tend to eat plastic bags in the oceans because they think that they're jellyfish. So by knowing that, then hopefully it stops us from producing and throwing out as many then of the plastic bags in. So those are all ideas to do then with natural selection, and also to do with evolution, and to do with extinction then. Now, We've gone then from natural selection. Let's move on then to something else called artificial selection. This is when farmers might then choose specifically to breed certain plants and certain animals together. If we use an example, now we know that this wheat here, this wheat here, then in fact, then you'll find then when we eat wheat, we want this part here. This is the part we're going to eat more of here then. So it makes sense that farmers want to grow plants which have these large cobs here then. Now what happens in fact is this: over time, the farmer over generation after generation will cross together the ones which produce then the most wheat. And over time, then what happens in fact is, instead of, if you left it normally, maybe it wouldn't grow as big, and for as long as this is one which is beginning to grow, this might be a normal one. Whereas they breed them specifically, then they cross big ones with big ones and big ones with big ones over many generations. They'll get to the stage then that we have wheat then, which produces a lot more useful parts which we can eat then. So the yield of the wheat has greatly increased then. That not only happens then with plants, it also happens, of course, with animals. We have selective breeding. Now, selective breeding can be done in different ways. It could be then for the case of beef. Now, if you look here then at cows and at different times then. Now, we've got different cows here. You can see at the top one here then, which was in 1900, you'll see that it wasn't as muscular as the one in 1970. And then as time goes on, you can see we've got more and more muscle. Okay, so a lot more muscle, a lot more of the cow which can be eaten here then. So selective breeding takes place. Other examples, as well as Aberdeen Angus, other examples then would include Friesians. The black and white cows are the ones, of course, then which we get lots of milk from. So over time, the farmers pick then the cows which produce the most milk. They will then reproduce them with the bulls, which are the biggest, and hopefully then the next generation, then you produce then a big cow which produces lots of milk then. So over time, they're specifically selecting the characteristics which they want to keep then. Other examples would be in dogs. Again, over time in dogs, again, then we select them. We select them in terms of size. We select them in terms of temperament, whether they are good guard dogs, for example. We select these things over time. Then. Problem though is sometimes that by over-selecting, what happens in fact is it's maybe they're not as strong as they should be, and therefore sometimes we can have situations where Alsatians, for example, have bad hips, and maybe their life expectancy isn't as long as it should be then. So selective breeding, in some respects, is very good, but in other respects can be quite dangerous to the animals then. So that's a bit then about then our variation and selection. Now, what should you do next then? Well, first of all, you've got notes which you have been given out then. If not, they'll be on Google Classroom. Try and fill in the notes. Now, you have textbooks. You can fill in most of the notes. Some parts are difficult, but you fill in as much of the notes as you can then. Also, of course, read the revision book. I know the vast majority of you have got the revision textbook, so read your notes, read your own textbooks, read the revision textbooks, all good sources of information. Now, also, of course, do past papers. We have got past paper questions in natural selection. If you haven't got those yet, then try and get them off someone. They'll be in school if school is still open. So try and make sure you do those past paper questions on natural selection. So that is me for now. That's all, folks. And I will leave you then to go back to relaxing. And hopefully, though, you've done a little bit of revision too. Thank you and goodbye.